On a crisp September night in 1982, a quiet Pennsylvania neighborhood became the site of one of the most horrifying mass murders in U.S. history. George Emil Banks, a man plagued by mental illness and consumed by apocalyptic delusions, took the lives of 13 people, including 5 of his own children. To fully grasp the weight of this tragedy, we must explore Banks's life in detail, examining the societal, psychological, and personal factors that culminated in this unspeakable act. George Emil Banks was born on June 22, 1942, in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. His mixed-race heritage immediately set him apart in a community and era steeped in racial tensions. Banks's father was black, and his mother was white, a union that subjected them to severe societal scorn. This stigma not only affected his parents but also shaped Banks's formative years, fostering a sense of alienation and resentment. As a child, Banks struggled to find his place in a world that seemed hostile and unwelcoming. He was teased and ostracized by peers, experiences that left indelible marks on his psyche. Teachers described him as bright but troubled, often prone to outbursts of anger and deep bouts of sadness. The Banks household was far from a sanctuary, with constant financial strain and frequent arguments between his parents exacerbating the young boy's emotional struggles. In his teenage years, Banks's behavior became increasingly erratic. He developed a mistrust of authority figures and began showing signs of paranoia. Friends and family noted his tendency to dwell on perceived slights, often escalating minor conflicts into major grievances. Despite his challenges, Banks managed to graduate high school and enlist in the U.S. The military provided structure and discipline, but it also exposed Banks to additional stressors. Stationed abroad, he experienced racism within the ranks, which deepened his feelings of isolation. After his discharge, Banks returned to Wilkes-Barre, but he struggled to reintegrate into civilian life. He bounced between jobs before securing a position as a prison guard at the State Correctional Institution at Camp Hill. Banks's personal relationships were as tumultuous as his internal world. Over the years, he fathered 7 children with 4 different women, all of whom were white. Banks claimed that he was rescuing these women and their children from what he saw as a corrupt and racially oppressive society. However, his relationships were marked by instability, jealousy, and abuse. His partners frequently described him as controlling and volatile, prone to violent outbursts when he felt disrespected. By the early 1980s, Banks's mental health had noticeably deteriorated. He became increasingly obsessed with apocalyptic themes, convinced that the world was on the brink of collapse. He expressed fears of racial genocide and began stockpiling weapons, claiming he needed to protect his family from impending doom. His erratic behavior alarmed those around him, but their warnings went unheeded. September 25, 1982, began like any other day for the residents of Wilkes-Barre. Few could have predicted the horrific events that would unfold as the sun set. That evening, Banks, armed with an AR-15 semi-automatic rifle, embarked on a killing spree that would claim 13 lives. The massacre began at Banks's home, where he lived with some of his children and their mothers. Fueled by delusions and paranoia, Banks shot his 5 children, their mothers, and a family friend. Witnesses later recalled hearing gunshots and screams, followed by an eerie silence. But Banks wasn't finished. He drove to a nearby residence, where he killed a former girlfriend and another child. He then continued his rampage at a third location, targeting a neighbor who had previously argued with him. By the time the bloodshed ended, Banks had killed 13 people, including 9 children, ranging in age from 1 to 11 years old. Following the killings, Banks fled the scene. A massive manhunt ensued, involving local police, state troopers, and federal agents. Banks was eventually located hiding in a wooded area near his home. After a tense standoff, he surrendered without resistance, reportedly stating that he had done what needed to be done. In the aftermath of his arrest, investigators pieced together the sequence of events and sought to understand Banks's motives. What emerged was a portrait of a man consumed by delusions and haunted by unresolved trauma. He claimed that he had killed his children to save them from the horrors of the world, a rationale that underscored his severe mental illness. The trial of George Emil Banks was one of the most sensational cases in Pennsylvania's history. The prosecution painted him as a remorseless killer, while the defense argued that he was legally insane at the time of the murders. Mental health experts testified about Banks's long history of schizophrenia and delusional disorder, but the jury ultimately rejected the insanity defense. In June 1983, Banks was convicted of 12 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. The verdict was met with mixed reactions. While many saw it as justice for the victims, others questioned the morality of executing someone with such profound mental health issues. Banks's case highlighted the challenges of addressing mental illness within the criminal justice system. Despite numerous red flags, he had received little to no effective treatment prior to the massacre. His descent into violence could have potentially been prevented with early intervention and proper care. The trial also raised questions about the use of the death penalty in cases involving severe mental illness. Advocates for mental health reform argued that Banks's condition should have been a mitigating factor, while others believed that his crimes were too heinous to warrant leniency. The debate continues to this day, as Banks remains on death row, his execution delayed by ongoing legal battles. The Wilkes-Barre community was left reeling in the wake of the massacre. The sheer scale of the tragedy, coupled with the young ages of many victims, created a sense of collective grief that lingers to this day. Vigils and memorials were held to honor the lives lost, and efforts were made to support the surviving family members. For many, the case served as a grim reminder of the devastating impact of untreated mental illness. It also prompted discussions about gun control, domestic violence, and the responsibilities of social services in protecting vulnerable individuals. The story of George Emil Banks is both a cautionary tale and a call to action. It underscores the importance of early intervention in addressing mental health issues and highlights the need for systemic changes in how society handles individuals at risk of violence. Banks's actions were inexcusable, but they were also preventable, a fact that adds another layer of tragedy to an already heartbreaking story. More than 4 decades after the massacre, the name George Emil Banks remains synonymous with one of the darkest chapters in Pennsylvania's history. His story is a stark reminder of the consequences of neglecting mental health and the fragile line between internal turmoil and outward violence. As society continues to grapple with issues of mental illness, gun violence, and justice, the lessons of Banks's case remain painfully relevant. To understand how a man like George Emil Banks could commit such a heinous act, it's crucial to examine the inner workings of his mind. Banks was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia during his trial, a condition characterized by delusions, hallucinations, and disordered thinking. In his case, these delusions manifested in apocalyptic beliefs and a warped view of reality that made his actions, in his mind, a necessary response to the world's perceived dangers. Banks believed he was protecting his children from a cruel world destined for destruction. This delusion, while incomprehensible to the average person, made sense within the distorted logic of his illness. Mental health professionals later explained how his paranoia and isolation had created a feedback loop, amplifying his fears and rendering him incapable of distinguishing between reality and his delusions. Another critical factor in Banks's descent was his isolation. Despite working as a prison guard, a role that brought him into regular contact with others, he lived a largely solitary existence. His relationships with the mothers of his children were strained and often marked by conflict, leaving him without a stable support system. Social isolation is a known risk factor for mental health deterioration, particularly for individuals already predisposed to conditions like schizophrenia. Without a network of friends or family to challenge his distorted thinking, Banks was left alone with his delusions, which grew stronger over time. In hindsight, there were numerous warning signs that Banks was spiraling out of control. His colleagues reported his increasingly erratic behavior, noting that he often spoke of impending doom and his mistrust of others. Friends and family also noticed his paranoia and violent tendencies, but were unsure how to intervene. At the time, mental health resources were limited, and societal stigma often prevented individuals from seeking help. Banks's access to firearms added another layer of danger. Despite his mental health struggles, he was able to legally purchase and own an AR-15 semi-automatic rifle. This fact raised questions about gun control laws and the processes for screening individuals with mental illnesses. Had stricter regulations been in place, it's possible that the massacre could have been prevented. The trial and subsequent appeals of George Emil Banks brought to the forefront complex legal and ethical questions, particularly regarding the death penalty and mental illness. Banks's defense team argued that executing someone with a severe mental illness constituted cruel and unusual punishment, a violation of the Eighth Amendment. This argument was part of a broader debate about the morality of capital punishment for individuals whose actions were driven by mental illness. While the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that executing individuals who are insane at the time of their execution is unconstitutional, the definition of insanity remains a contentious issue. In Banks's case, his mental state has continued to deteriorate during his decades on death row. This has further delayed his execution, raising questions about the purpose and effectiveness of the death penalty in cases involving mental illness. The George Emil Banks case captured national attention, dominating headlines and sparking intense public debate. True crime documentaries, books, and articles have analyzed the case from various angles, exploring its psychological, legal, and societal dimensions. However, the media coverage also drew criticism for its sensationalism. Some argued that the focus on Banks's mental illness risked overshadowing the victims and their families. This tension reflects broader challenges in how the media handles cases of mass violence, balancing the need for in-depth analysis with sensitivity to those affected. In the years since the massacre, those who knew George Banks and the victims have shared their perspectives on the tragedy. Former colleagues described Banks as a ticking time bomb, while friends of the victims spoke of the profound loss and grief that rippled through the community. Law enforcement officials who responded to the scene have also reflected on the challenges of dealing with such a horrific crime. Many were deeply affected by what they witnessed, highlighting the psychological toll that such events take on first responders. While the events of September 25, 1982, can never be undone, they have served as a catalyst for change. Advocacy efforts have focused on improving mental health care, strengthening gun control laws, and fostering a greater understanding of the factors that lead to mass violence. These efforts aim to create a society where such tragedies are less likely to occur. The story of George Emil Banks is one of immense tragedy and complex moral questions. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about our society and our responsibilities to one another. While justice has been served in a legal sense, the deeper lessons of the case remain relevant as we strive to build a more compassionate and equitable world.